So often when I get asked, what is a just transition? My first answer is, it's about people. And that is exactly what we're going to be looking at this session. So we're going to be exploring the just transition through the lens of creating jobs in the green economy and having some practical examples of how that can be done, and that has been done through case studies from Cape Town and the transatlantic green tech special development zone. And we're also going to be delving into, when we talk about inclusion, who exactly are we including? So we are going to be looking at job creation for youth and also the inclusion of youth. One of the things that have come out strongly in the past couple of years with the youth movement is that the youth want to be involved. They don't want to be sidelined and, sitting at the little table. So how do we include youth when we're talking about climate change, when we're talking about the just transition? And also we are sitting with a very high unemployment rate. So how do we create jobs for the young people and also involve the young people in creating those jobs in South Africa? So that's what we're going to be looking at, including also the gender lens. Women are often left behind in this talks and also in these processes. We were in the session, we were talking about, industrial development, mining, energy, all those sectors where women still represent a very small percentage. So when we're talking about a transition, we have to also look at the gender roles and who's being included and who has been left behind, who we need to include in this process. So without saying too much, I'm going to welcome our first presentation, which is going to be an online presentation. And I've practiced for like the last 15 minutes to say her name correctly. So if I get it wrong, please forgive me, it's the vendor in me. So it's Nontsikelelo, Mngqibisa. I'll get it right next time.
I did. You got it right.
Oh, thank you. That is so gratifying to hear. So Nontsikelelo is a sustainable development professional specializing in evidence and research, knowledge management, learning and partner relations, and also engineering. She has a specific expertise in the areas of climate resilient infrastructure, planning, gender mainstreaming, agriculture, and livelihoods. She's currently doing her PhD at the Sustainable Transition at Stellenbosch University, focusing on the Atlantic Special Economic Zone and the inclusion of gender in the local green economy. So Nontsikelelo will be giving us our first presentation, looking at the developing a gender action plan for the Atlantic Green Tech Special Economic Zone for emerging localized green economy. So welcome, Nontsikelelo.
As the speaker has introduced, my name is Nontsikelelo Mngqibisa, and this is my colleague, Christelle Solomons, who is the skills specialist here at the Atlantis Special Economic Zone. So by way of context, I'll discuss the background and location and history. I'll then sort of go through briefly the policies and the plans and strategies that support green growth. I don't want to sort of rehash anything because we've sort of gone through that yesterday in the conference. And then I'll go through the current situation here at the ASCZ, and then my colleague Christelle Solomons will go through the skills program that they're currently running. And then I'll go through the findings and recommendations. So I am based in the Atlantis Special Economic Zone as an embedded researcher. So yes, next slide, just to give the full context. So the aim of the presentation will be to explore the role of the ASCZ in promoting gender inclusive green economy through the skills program that they are running. Next slide, please. Next slide. So the ASCZ is located approximately 50 kilometers north of the Cape Town CBD. So just for reference, the distance between Johannesburg and Pretoria CBD is about 50 kilometers. So it's quite far from the CBD, but quite next to the Saldanha IDZ, and about 50 kilometers, I think, from Cape Town to Paarl and then Stellenbosch, I think. So it is quite far from the CBD. Next slide, please. So just the history of Atlantis, I can't see properly here. So as you can see, in the 1980s, there were almost 13,000 jobs created in Atlantis. And I mean, obviously they didn't have the commitment of environmental commitments, of decoupling. So they moved forward, and there were about 50 industrialists in Atlantis then. And then there was the City of Cape Town's Atlantis Revitalization Framework in 2012. Yes. So the Atlantis, I think my colleague Julia discussed this yesterday, that the Atlantis was established during the 1970s by the apartheid government as an industrial center or node. And a community from Cape Town, District 6, was removed and sort of planted here. And sort of flourished in the mid to late 1980s under a program of sort of significant targeted government support. So there were a lot of tax incentives. And then the tax incentives were withdrawn in the mid 1980s, and the economic sort of activity started to decline. And so the socioeconomic problems and challenges started to rise then. So as you can see, the manufacturing constitutes 55% of the economic activity in Atlantis industrial, while wholesale and retail contributes only 15%. So manufacturing is quite a big activity here, obviously, as it's a manufacturing hub. And that's why the special economic zone is now focusing, which is the first in South Africa, on manufacturing green tech. So it's a green tech special economic zone, just to put that out there. Next slide, please. And I've just sort of broken down the sectors, so being mining and retail services, and then manufacturing. And as you can see, obviously, still manufacturing is quite the largest sector here. Next slide. So yeah, I'm also struggling to see the screen. I'm so sorry. I see comments online. So just to go through the policy plans and strategies in support of green growth, we've sort of gone through that yesterday, but I've put them together, and we can see, and we all know, that it's been quite a journey of, almost 10 years of green economic policies. And the projects here have been, they've developed green RDP houses in Atlantis, and there's been a wine farm, not a wind farm, sorry. And so there's, it's been a journey of sort of green economic growth policies here. Next slide. I can't see, can you see there? Next slide, please. So just to give a definition of green economy and green tech and green skills and gender. And the simplest form of green economy can be thought of as one which is low carbon, resource efficient, and socially inclusive. And that's sort of the goal of the Atlantis Special Economic Zone. So green economy, green tech refers to technologies that limit or prevent harm to the natural environment. And the green skills are the knowledge and the abilities, values, and attitudes needed to live in. And gender refers to the social attributes and opportunities associated with being male and female, and the relationships thereof. Next slide, please. So because the ASCZ focuses on green tech, we also committed to being resource efficient and low carbon. And I've sort of put the green tech in the middle and say it includes, activities that produce products and services that reduce harm to environment relative to conventional alternatives. Green tech spans manufacturing and services, and green tech production can be, but it's not necessarily also resource efficient and low carbon. Next slide, please. So I'll just go through what the current situation at the ASCZ is and how they're contributing to a green economy. So at the moment, the ASCZ runs a skills development program. And they've developed, well, there's been just under 500 skills development beneficiaries. There's been a formal contract with the community stakeholder network, which enables direct community participation. They've supported just under 50 SMMEs through enterprise development, and around 400 jobs were created. And there's been, sustainable infrastructure development strategies, the net zero water, net zero waste, net zero carbon strategies developed. And I see those as sort of key to the goal around net zero and resource efficiency of the ASCZ. Next slide, please. So, the question, I guess, is then how do these skills program play a role in developing not just a green economy, but an inclusive green economy at the ASCZ? I'll give Christelle to speak a little bit about the skills program.
Good day, everybody. And like my colleague has mentioned, the key objective of this work stream, specifically the skills work stream, is to ensure that the entire community of Atlantis have access to green tech and then also to employment opportunities ultimately where it comes to green technology. So the green skills programs that we have introduced to the community of Atlantis, we've started off with a water treatment program of our local community, and there we can clearly say that we could manage to at least have 50% of that cohort. We have female and male cohorts in that program, and that was a very successful program. We've done the waste management programs. We've also done solar PV training programs, welding programs, as well as our ECD programs, which is very excited. We're all excited about, because it's like raising little green babies in Atlantis and surrounding areas, where we work with ECD centers locally, equipping the ECD centers, and in the same process, whilst we equip the teachers, the practitioners, they are creating an awareness within the ECD centers about green technology and the importance of sustainability in the green sector. So yes, thank you very much, Nani.
Next slide, please. Thank you, Christelle. So as you can see, we've sort of disaggregated the data with gender and race. And it's the gender obviously being predominantly male over female and predominantly colored. But that makes sense because Atlantis is a predominantly colored area. Next slide, please. So the findings are that the ASCZ's integrated ecosystem portfolio, which heads the skills program and enterprise program, aims to maximize opportunities for local employment for women and youth and pursue opportunities in the investor value chain and inside and outside the zone, so there's spillovers. And participatory and collaborative approaches are key in making the voices of women heard. And this can be seen through the ACZ's formal contract again with the community stakeholder network, in which 4 out of 9 women are influential. And the ACZ skills and enterprise development programs are done through partnerships. And I mean, I believe that, and it's been well acknowledged that partnerships and collaboration contribute to the resilience of the community. And they've partnered with institutions such as Sarebi, UWC, CPUT, NBI, and Lesedi, and a lot of other partnerships. And they are actively curated and co-developed in line with potential green tech investor needs at the ACZ. Next slide, please. And although the beneficiaries of the skills development program are not majority women, the ACZ is actively following the involvement of female-owned SMMEs for incubation programs. So the ACZ cannot employ anyone from the informal economies, to say, who is not fully registered as the ACZ is a state-owned entity. And perhaps changing those policies to engage more with the informal economy, where there are majority women-led SMMEs, will allow more women to be mainstreamed. And because the ACZ is an actual industrial emerging project, if gender mainstreaming is done, it could allow for the development of a gendered industrial development framework. Thank you.
Thank you. I was getting worried about time there, but it seems you were almost finished. And thank you for that very informative presentation. So our next speaker is Masibulele Zonyana, who is going to be looking at public employment programs and inclusion of economic growth opportunities, promoting a just transition through public entrepreneurship. This will be looking at a case study for the city of Cape Town. So Masibulele is the head of employment and skills development at the city of Cape Town. His work involves the job seekers database, skills development, policy and research, and expanding the public works program department. In this position, he works on socio-economic and policy issues relating directly to the development of the poor in the city. So Masibulele, over to you.
Thank you. Morning, everyone. So I'm definitely going to hop through the presentation because of what has been discussed both yesterday and today. But what's coming out of the discussions and my presentation is that even within the city of Cape Town, the entire just transition process is facing similar challenges around institutionalization, a strong coordinator, and support in general. And this we found through interviewing 10 strategic senior officials within the city. So initially, I'm one of those local government employees who didn't understand anything about just transition up until TIPS had this abstract call. So I will admit to not knowing anything much about what this is about. But then when I started reading about the just transition, I found that actually many of the challenges that are facing this process or this path are challenges that the city's public employment programs actually faced way back before 2010. And this was very interesting to me. And okay, why is this? And how did the city's public employment programs office, or at least the entire process, get out of the challenges of institutionalization, get out of the challenges of a lack of coordination, support, finance, and actually getting officials inculcated or at least familiarized with what public employment programs were. And then when we look at that, we find that, yes. So when I tried to look at how the city's public employment programs got through this and what it is that the just transition process can learn out of this process. We found that, for instance, before 2010, the City of Cape Town's public employment program is struggling to report. They actually had a couple of, in fact, a significant amount of officials who were very unfamiliar with what EPWP or public employment is about. Up until in 2011, a new political leadership came with the then mayor who had a strong drive around creating work opportunities. Then within the EPWP office, a couple of appointments were made, whom decided to try and drive the institutionalization of the public employment programs of the city. And one of these responsible officials is one of our interviewees who actually used his experience from the provincial government in implementing what he calls program design. And what program design is about is literally about ensuring that you have a program that's based on institutionalization. First, get your political support and then use that support to institutionalize the whatever you are doing, whether it's, in this case, the just transition. How you institutionalize that, you start with policies, frameworks that everyone understands. Then you group every stakeholder together, ensure that you understand what each stakeholder needs, ensure that you understand where each stakeholder lacks, ensure that you understand the benefits of each stakeholder in the program that you are trying to drive. And this, our interview calls part of what he calls program design in the province. They started this through what they were calling impact assessments. So when he got to the city, he found the going a bit tougher at the local government. So the approach was to target specialists within the strategic fields that were important for EPWP, and that included supply chain, tender, contract management, and so on. And within the process of trying to understand and ensure that you bring stakeholders on board, our interviewee then asked this team to think of ways of incorporating the public employment programs mandate within the tender process of the city. At the same time, the mayor and the political leadership that came in 2011, which basically represent a critical juncture for the entire process, were pushing senior management of the city to employ and create employment program opportunities within the city directly. And this, while at the level of administrators, they were pushing for the institutionalization of this political support. This is why the City of Cape Town in 2011 developed successfully a policy on the recruitment of community-based workers. And then 2 years later from that, they developed successfully a policy on the implementation of the expanded public works. What's important about this process is that the policy itself brought all of the stakeholders on board. So the city's EPWP or public employment programs are actually driven by a group called the EPWP Working Group, not by one office, not by one department. All of the departments of the city have a senior representative in the EPWP Working Group who bring the unique and nuanced understandings of what public employment programs look like for instance, a department like transport, water, and so on. And then this platform drives the city's processes. And then when we look at what this means, then particularly for one of the aims of this paper to push a concept we call public entrepreneurship, is that when these processes were put in place by both the political leadership that got into the city in 2011 and the administrators, we started to see that through the interviews that a specific kind of space was coming up out in the city. This space was supporting people with ideas. This space was supporting collaborations between departments and eventually between external stakeholders. And then more importantly, our interviewee, particularly the one who was driving EPWP, found that it was quite important to improve in this concept he calls program design by ensuring that there's consistent case studies around ensuring specific outcomes. You understand your target market, which in this case was the poor and the vulnerable. What kind of skills do they have? What kind of opportunities can you create for them? You understand your stakeholders through evidence-based approach, the case studies, and you ensure that when you create this program, continuously improving, you create, you improve around these understandings that are coming out from these case studies. So between 2012 and 2015, what the office did was to at least institute 3 such studies. And at every point, these studies would come up with a way of improving the program, particularly on how to use collaborations. One of the most interesting of such outcomes is that within the Environment and Management Department, there's a specific branch that has been using the expanding public works of the city to implement programs and projects to ensure that the city achieves its environmental targets. And one of those projects, which is called the Kariasmal Catchment Project, has been so significant for the city in such that it was extended to Atlantis, the version of it. Recently, last year, was extended to Atlantis, where we find that the project manager of that project from the department called Enterprise and Investment notes in the interview with me that the success of this project, which became an instrument that's gazetted by the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment. I've been practicing this. So the success of this project significantly relied on the EPWP processes of the city, public employment process of the city, to such an extent that it benefited every stakeholder, which speaks to the program design elements that our interviewee spoke about, who was driving the EPWP. The interviewee around this project notes that communities were happy with the project. The city benefited by clearing invasive species on a piece of land that is very strategic for the water sources of the city. Atlantis apparently is on top of an aquifer. I don't understand these things, but it's a strategic water resource for the city. But what's more important for me, this interviewee, who is not an implementer of EPWP, found the entire institutional arrangements of the EPWP of the city to be very helpful, extremely helpful. And what this means for us is that when we interviewed then the 2 senior officials of the city from this Environment Management Department who have been implementing public employment programs for the past 10 years, they themselves note that many of their successes, like being the only branch in the country to run a project that manages a special kind of invasive beetle. Not sure what that is, but apparently there's a special kind of invasive beetle that's found in Gauteng and other provinces. They are the only department or branch, they're not even a department, that has a program that manages this. And this entire project is run on the basis of the city's public employment programs. This is a unit that was very instrumental in the instrument that the department now has. They note that all of what you see there in the city currently is provided by the institutional arrangements of the Public Employment Program Office, to an extent that in 2015, when they struggled to get specific contractors to run projects in the Westlake areas to baboon management, snake management, invasive species clearing, they found that the tender process of the city were not speaking to their needs. They went to the supply chain using the city's EPWP environments and support from the EPWP office, had discussions with the contract development people and supply management to such an extent that this led to them being able to change and influence the tenders of the city to such an extent that they now run a program called the mentorship model. And this mentorship model is the only one I know in the city where a branch of the city uses contractors to develop SMMEs from EPWP participants to an extent or level that these micro SMMEs get to supply the very same department of the city. It's amazing stuff. Over the last 7 years, they've assisted over 20 that I can think of, And many of these former EPWP workers who are now micro enterprise owners have come to note that they're able to sustain themselves outside the dependence of the EPWP, even though they would like for the EPWP opportunities to continue as enterprise development people. So this is the snippet from the initial tender specifications that they managed to insert back in 2015 with the support of the institutional arrangements that come from public employment programs of the city. And that is a version of the mentorship model. And again, in my 10 years of the city, working for the city, there's nothing like that, including the Atlantis examples that were mentioned previously. So what we see is this through what our interviewee, who was the manager for the EPWP office for at least 10 years, is now working for urban mobility, is that through this program design, find a few elements. Strong political support that you as an administrator deliberately try to turn into an institutional arrangement that include policies, that include stakeholders that are specialists in different fields. This is coming out from the interviews. You then try and ensure that you, from that, you create a program that's based on the needs of your main target market. But not only that, you create a program that ensures that there are benefits for all your stakeholders. In the case of the city's public employment programs, those benefits were fairly easy for the politicians, create massive opportunities of for the unemployed. But then what's even more important for this thing that our interviewee calls program design is thinking about immediately ways of mainstreaming the program so that it doesn't depend on grants. And this is what we heard yesterday from the DG. This is what we keep hearing from the discussions currently, the issue around mainstreaming, whatever you're doing. Program design of the City of Cape Town's public employment programs thought about and continues to think about mainstreaming to an extent that 4 or 5 years ago, we had a deliberate drive of mainstreaming the EPWP. Currently, so currently we have a situation where all departments allocate budgets for EPWP creation, EPWP projects, skills development from their own budgets, besides the grant we get from everywhere else. So what you see in the conclusion is that the city's public employment programs have been successful in supporting the city in any economic circumstance. We also find that within the just transition space, the challenges that are there were challenges that we experience in the city's public employment program space, and we managed to deal with these challenges in this program design approach. And then the biggest question perhaps that is should be asked to the room is, if we are able to do these things at the City of Cape Town level, how is it that the government and these outcomes, how is it that they can influence and get the government to rethink their approach and position on who is responsible for what in the economy between the private sector and government? Thank you.
That was very interesting. Shakespeare says a rose by any other name is still a rose. So I guess that applies to just transition. So it's interesting to hear that you were not thinking of this as just transition as you were doing it, but there is definitely work going on in municipalities around the country that contributes to the just transition, and we might just be calling it something else. So our next presentation is going to be looking at leveraging the expanded public works program for inclusive just transition, improving labor market conditions for the youth in the green economy through city-led partnerships. So this presentation will be led by Mamokete Modiba, along with Olga Koma. So both Olga and Mamokete are from the Gauteng City Region Observatory. So take it away, ladies.
Good morning, everyone. As she has already stated, my name is Mamokete Modiba. I'm from the GCRO. And what we're going to be presenting to you today is part of a bigger project that we were involved in We wrote this paper together with a colleague, Charles Parkerson, that maybe some of you might know. He's the former director of economic development at SARChI. So this project is part of a bigger project that we were involved in from April until the end of or mid-July. And we're looking at how do we reskill the future workforce, looking at ways in which we can create opportunities for the youth and people with disabilities in the green economy and the digital economy. Next slide, please. So the way that we've organized our paper is that we'll be looking at, it's got an introduction, and we also get into a contextual background of some of the issues of youth unemployment in the country. And then we get into some of the methods that we used in order to gain access to some of the insights that we'll be sharing with you today. And then a literature review that looks at the evolution of the policies and other legislative frameworks that deal with the green economy in South African context. We look at the green economy and the extent to which the youth participate in this economy. Some of the experiences that municipalities, particularly the metros, because we spoke quite extensively with the metros, in terms of what are the projects that they're implementing in the green economy space as part of the EPWP, and what has been the extent of youth participation in those projects. And then we get into some of the existing programs that municipalities have, that other spheres of government like the provincial government, the national government have, and also in the private sector. What other existing programs are there that deal with the green economy project, sector? And then also we looked at what is happening internationally, where there have been programs that have been implemented that speak to youth unemployment. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Olga to take you through the contextual background.
That's fine. Thank you very much, Mamokete. If I can just correct, I'm not from the GCRO. I'm an independent researcher. Yeah. So my name is Olga Koma, and thank you very much for being here. Just to give you the contextual background, but as I've been listening to the previous speaker, I can see that already there's been a lot of conversation and unpacking around the issues of the EPWP. So I'll just quickly run through the contextual background and then touch very briefly on the methodologies that we used for our project. So as you know, everybody in South Africa, that the youth unemployment is at an all-time high, which is hovering close to about 70%. And from the data that we've reviewed also, we can see how COVID has had such an adverse effect on these numbers. I mean, between 2019 and 2022, there's been an increase of over 10% in unemployment that has affected the youth. So of the 10 million youths that are in the labor force, not in the labor force, the 10 million youths that are in the country, around 75% of them are inactive, meaning that they have lost hope and all of that. And this vulnerability basically is due to a number of systematic challenges, the main ones being obviously the lack of access to education and the development thereof of the relevant skills that are then aligned to the current labor market needs. Therefore, what we have is that there's a mismatch between the skills or the lack of that the youth have, as well as what is currently available within the labor market, or what is rather needed. So the numbers also shows that even graduates are increasingly finding it very difficult to find employment, and both the educated and the uneducated experience the lowest absorption and labor market participation rates. And increasingly, the labor market is preferring more and more experienced people. And what we see is that the graduates and people that have matric or less are increasingly competing for the same types of jobs. And this is due to the lack of experience mostly around what the youth have. And with there not being no entry-level jobs available, this leads obviously to a major challenges of youth then not being able to secure employment. And we end up in a situation where most of the youth end up in survivalist, poor quality jobs with very low income, and they are vulnerable to exploitation. If you can please go to the next slide. Yeah, so with EPWP, obviously it's a PEP program that aims to offer short-term employment and training opportunities to your most disadvantaged of workers. And the program essentially is an essential program that I think it's still needed because you have the private sector that is not able to absorb as many people into the labor market as much as it can. And out of its inception, it was to provide a more intensive labor projects within the infrastructure, the social, the environmental, as well as the cultural sector. And the main aims and the outputs are focused mainly on providing education and training opportunities. And one of the target groups has been the youth, amongst many other. And however, the cities that we interviewed, which is mostly the 7 or 9 metropolitan cities that we interviewed around the target groups, are finding it very difficult to attract the youth to come onto this program. And the reason that they are finding it mostly difficult to attract the youth is that the youth seem to be uninterested in the type of employment that is offered. And the program therefore faces a lot of challenges and around resource limitations, which therefore has an adverse impact on the types of work that is able to generate, and therefore training opportunities that is able to offer the youth. So you end up with the youth that are upon exiting the program, they only know how to mix concrete, for example. If you can please go to the next slide. Yeah, so the methodology that we utilized for the program, for the project, was around desktop research. We interviewed a variety of stakeholders, and we did a review of some of the case studies internationally to see what is on offer. And basically the desktop research was a way of us mapping up some of the key stakeholders in relation to the green sector, which Mamokete will then get into, and also to identify the current EPWP projects that are implemented within the city. And remember, it was around the green economy and the extent of the participation of the vulnerable groups, and just to basically unpack and understand what the successes and the challenges were. I think I'll leave it there, then Mamokete can then go into our key findings. Thank you.
So in terms of the literature review, I'm not going to go into detail, I'll just brush through it. But as I've said, basically, we looked at the evolution of policy in the South African context and what it's been saying. So the one thing that comes out from that is the fact that until recently, there was no coherent policy or a framework in terms of how we actually go about achieving this just transition. Next slide, please. Next slide. So yeah, one of the main issues that we actually go into detail about in the paper is the fact that the role of rapid urbanization and population growth in our cities. We know that cities absorb more and more people, and that has implications on the resources, the amount of resources that are consumed in cities. And as a result, we experience a lot of environmental degradation. Next slide. Next slide, please. So in terms of some of the insights that we got from interviewing city officials, national departments and other stakeholders like the ILO and the NYDA, one of the things that came up was the fact that a lot of cities are implementing a number of projects within the green economy space, but they mostly in the waste management, urban management type of projects, farming and gardening projects. So actually one of the officials that we interviewed was talking about how the types of green economy projects in cities is some sort of a manicure and pedicure type of projects, and there are no innovations in the space, which is why they're finding it very difficult to recruit the youth into some of these projects. one thing that also all the officials were mainly speaking to in terms of the participation of the youth was the fact that they associated with debt and unfavorable working conditions. Because as most of you know, some of these EPW projects, you'll find people working outside, and I mean, they don't have development prospects for the youth. So that's why they're not really interested. The types of work and training opportunities that these projects have, they don't actually match the skills that are demanded in the labor market, which is something that Olga spoke to. Training is mostly project specific. So if you get invited into a project or involved in a project where construction is happening, it's the type of training that you're going to get is related to that. As Olga said, like mixing concrete, getting training on that. That is not something that actually gives you prospects to participate in the labor market in the future. And also the fact that some of these green economy projects, they're not really implemented with partnerships. So what the types of partnerships that you find is cities, the EPWP unit working together with line departments, and in some cases national departments, but they are seldom these partnerships with the private sector. And in some cases where there is partnerships with the private sector gives funding, and when that funding runs out, then the project is jeopardized. There isn't a lot of innovation in terms of the types of partnerships that could be struck in order to ensure that the youth participate. Next slide. So in this section, what we tried to do was to connect some of the existing programs and what we learned internationally in terms of where projects have been implemented with the participation of the youth in mind, and try to connect that with the youth unemployment problem in South Africa. But of course, what we are not trying to do here is to sort of provide a silver bullet in terms of we know that the problem of youth unemployment is very complicated, but these are some of the directions that we think maybe cities could be thinking around in terms of crafting a way forward to deal with the youth unemployment problem. So what we found in terms of the existing programs, something that COCTA was doing during lockdown or during when the COVID-19 pandemic outbreak was the fact that they were doing something. There's a project that they're doing around solid waste management. And we thought that this could be something that cities could leverage on in terms of creating opportunities for the youth. And then there was also a program by DFF, I'm not even going to try and spell out the acronym, where they were trying to train and develop local people as partners in the conservation of wildlife and protected areas. So there was training that was given to the participants in order to understand conservation and all of that. And then in terms of some of the case studies that we looked at internationally, there was a case study, a particularly interesting case study that was implemented in Ghana, where they were looking at the development of an environmentally sound e-waste management system. I'm not going to get into the details because I have like a minute left. But it was mainly about inviting the youth into the program, giving them training that was related to what was demanded in the labor market, so that after being involved in that project, they were able to then search for opportunities in the labor market. Next slide. So in this slide, we're also looking at examples where the youth were recruited into programs where the types of projects that they were involved in actually had some prospects for future career in those projects. So I'm not going to go into it. If you're interested in looking at some of these case studies and the programs that we look at, you can look at our paper, the draft that we currently have. Next slide. And then just to say, to think about what all of this means as we're trying to deal with the youth unemployment program, and we're connecting that with opportunities that exist in the EPWP, particularly the green economy. I think what we are saying in the paper is that there's a need to reconfigure the education and training that happens within the EPWP space in order to respond to what is happening in the labor market. And then tying that to what some of the prospects and some of the career pathing that the youth are interested in. Also being able to identify multiple exit points for the EPWP and maintain contact with participants in order to see that the participants that were involved in a particular project, how are they faring in the labor market post the project that they're involved in. And also we think that there's a need to understand in detail some of the hindrances to employability of the youth, as well as what is it that the youth actually prefer in terms of career opportunities, in terms of employment opportunities, and then also cities strike partnerships that will allow them in order to implement projects that have future prospects for the youth. So we actually speak a lot about partnerships and the role that partnerships can play in ensuring that EPW projects are not just projects that are there to just give short-term employment to people, but without actually having an impact on the career that they want to pursue in the green economy. Thank you.
It's interesting to learn that it's not just about jobs, but it's also about the quality of jobs and having skills that are transferable. And I think I've been based at a municipality for the last 2 months, and there's definitely more going on in there than just what the EPW programs are currently providing. So as you said, there's space to look at partnerships and also to look at other things that are happening with these cities where youth could be employed, where young people could be employed that are just not short-term jobs. So for our last presentation, we'll be looking at just transition in South Africa, a case for a gender just approach, which will be presented by Nokwanda Maseko. I'm also pronouncing that right. I seem to be butchering people's names today. So Nokwanda Maseko is a senior economist at TIPS. Her work at TIPS is an intersection of industrial policy, just transition, and gender. So Nokwanda, take it away.
Thank you. Afternoon, everyone. As already has been said, my name is Nokwanda Maseko. I am a senior economist at TIPS. Thank you. Can you please move on to the next slide? Just briefly, I will be providing a situational overview as well as trying to explain why a gender just approach is necessary for the just transition, and then briefly looking at women's location within the economy. And then I will end off with what would essentially be a starting point for a gender just approach. Next slide, please. Just to situate ourselves, so we know that globally women perform the bulk of the work that's done. I think that's a given. That's something we don't need to argue about. And when I talk about the work that women do, it includes both paid work as well as unpaid care work. And we know that women just generally do the bulk of unpaid care work globally. So what does that have to do with the just transition? When we think of the just transition, first of all, when we talk about, especially around the energy transition, what we're saying is we need to figure out how to assist people that stand to lose jobs because of the energy transition. The problem there is that women cannot transition from jobs they don't have. And we know globally, even in South Africa, women's labor force participation is generally lower. I think it went down to just under 50% as a result of the pandemic, and that's just in South Africa. And when we also talk about care work, what we're speaking about is the work that we do at home. So cooking, taking care of the children. And this is important work, don't get me wrong, because as has been noted, that work essentially closes some of the spending gaps in terms of what the state can provide. This is in terms of healthcare. This is in terms of taking care of children and the elderly. This is also in terms of education within communities. all of this essentially then takes away from the amount of time that women have to seek paid employment or start businesses or all the other things that we generally tend to think of when we talk about economic participation. And so what we're looking at right now is, even with the transition itself, the bigger structural problems have not been solved for. And again, that goes back to what keeps women out of paid economic activity. And because we haven't solved for those issues, we see that even within renewable energy jobs which have been touted as presenting the opportunities for gender equity, for example, women still accounted for around 32% of those employed in renewable energy jobs. And that speaks to the gaps that still exist in terms of what women have access, what opportunities they have access to. And fundamentally, I think if nothing else, what you need to take away from this presentation is that we can do all the just transition talking that we want, but if we're not addressing the structural problems that are keeping women away from employment and all these other economic activities, then we'll not be solving the gender equity issues that we're facing, but we will also then be compounding those problems. And so the just transition is not going to be inclusive, and therefore it is not going to be just. Next slide, please. So why do we need a gender just approach? So I split this up in terms of just looking at the actual climate impact and how they are gendered, as well as then trying to locate women within society. So in terms of climate impacts, we know that these are gendered such that women tend to face the brunt of those impacts. So if you look at, for example, the data I have there, you look at the cyclone in Myanmar in 2008, about 61% of the people affected by that cyclone were women. You look at Cyclone Idai that impacted Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and other areas within SARChI. We see also that about 500,000 of the people that were impacted were women, and about 75,000 of those women were pregnant. And so in terms of the impact biophysically, it goes to, so how women are affected, it goes to life expectancy as well. And this is not to say that there are, I don't know, physical differences between men and women in terms of what they can and cannot do. But what has been found is that because women are spending so much time doing care work, they don't have the time for other things like learning to swim. It's a very important thing when there's a cyclone, for example. The other thing then that I mentioned in the paper and in the presentation is that we'll also then start to see increased levels of violence during times of disaster. Moreover, women's life expectancy actually reduces. So one, if they don't die during the natural disaster, so they either die at higher percentages during the disaster, and also what we found, excuse me, I'm trying to regain my English. And the other thing is that women are killed at younger ages, and therefore also affects women's life expectancy as well. Also the increased levels of violence, which is something that was reported during Cyclone Idai, as well as then having to face forced labor at the time. And so some of the things that we've seen, for example, as a result of climate change is, as the climate dries up, women are having to walk longer distances to get water. Again, that takes away from them being able to be in paid employment. And so locating women within society, I think because of the way that our economy is structured and the way that the country is structured, bringing it locally, is that we tend to think of men as workers and women as caregivers. And again, I'm going to keep coming back to this issue of unpaid care work. When women are within paid employment, they tend to be concentrated in caregiving sectors. So we see that the overrepresentation in healthcare, overrepresentation in education sectors, as well as just taking care of the elderly. And again, that also then affects the kinds of resources that women have access to, so that they're able to adapt or mitigate against the impacts of climate change. So what does that mean in numbers when we say that women have less resources? So we see, for example, that in 2019, about 50% of those living in women-headed households dependent on grants and remittances for income, compared to about 23% of those living in men-headed households. When you disaggregate that information by race, you find that it increases to about 53% for those in Black women-headed households. Moreover, about 75% of those in men-headed households depend on salaries, income from businesses, as well as bonuses, pensions, and all those things, compared to only about 48% for those in women-headed households. And just that, not having access to those resources, it affects the ways in which women are able to adapt to climate change, as well as mitigate against the impacts of climate change. And I'm going to be mixing policy briefs here, but one of the interesting things that I read was a case in Cape Town just before there was flooding, where one of the women was saying she was putting sandbags in front of her house, just trying to prevent it from flooding, and yet it still flooded. What does that then mean for the many other women in South Africa that don't have resources? Next slide, please. I'm not going to go too much into this data just because I think we all know it. But as I've previously mentioned, women, again, do a lot of the care work globally. So if you look at the numbers globally, around 2% of men perform care work on a full-time basis. And this is men who are of employment age, so 15 to about 64. You compare that with about 25% of women who are of the same age who could also be in employment. So globally, a quarter of the working age population of women is sitting at home performing care work. And that greatly reduces their resources. It greatly reduces or hinders how they're able to deal with the impacts of climate change. And again, these issues then tend to be exacerbated in times of crisis. We see also with COVID-19, I mean, not accounting for the sectors that women that were affected, that women are predominantly in, like tourism. But we also see that even though women accounted for around 39% of employment in 2019 globally, they accounted for 54% of job losses. What does that say about how we're thinking of women in terms of economic opportunity and their place in just in the country and also in the world? I'm not going to go into the rest of that. Next slide, please. So this is just, again, I'm not going to go too much into this, but this is just to show where women are located in terms of paid economic activity. And we see here that women are generally in care, in care sectors, so community, social, and personal services, as well as private households, more so for Black women, as well as in some instances for colored women. And those numbers differ greatly also when you compare by race, as well as when you compare by gender. And if you look at the occupations, women generally tend to be in lower paying occupations where the level of skills are also lower. And what that means is therefore women tend to generally have lesser transferable skills unless we're thinking of like secretarial work as being an important skill in the I cannot see, sorry. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so, okay, let me move on because I've got 3 minutes. Okay, so just as a starting point for a gender just approach, as I said earlier, I think the key takeaway here is that if we don't change the structural issues that keep women out of paid economic activities, that greatly affects how they're able to adapt or mitigate against the impact of climate change. But whatever we do in terms of inclusion, we need to fix for the issues that keep women out of paid economic activity. And some of those things are very basic, like access to childcare. Some studies have found that access to childcare increases women's labor force participation by as much as 7%. Some companies have also piloted childcare on site at work, like Nestle South Africa was doing that in their Bryanston offices, but obviously that was head office and not where the majority of their workers actually work, especially those that low income workers. Also, we need to think about, how do we include women in technical fields as well? It's not just about saying, oh, here are women, we're going to be employing them at this renewable energy plant as secretaries or receptionists. How do we get them into the technical skills so that they're able to transfer those skills into other areas within the context of the just transition? But also, we need to promote women. Like, you can't expect women to keep doing the work and then not wanting to promote them. Some of those basic things that we tend to think of as, that's very political or that's very, something else. We need to think about those as well. And then also just reframing what we consider as work. And also what we consider as whose work. And that starts from, I think, generally from a young age, where right now we have these gender stereotypes that say women must go into humanities and men must go into technical fields. How do we then address that so that when women enter into tertiary institutions, for example, they're comfortable in terms of going into technical fields rather than just going into humanities because that's the easier thing. So just briefly, I have not touched on any industrial policy tools here because I think it is important to get some of the basic framing before we can even talk about some of the industrial policy tools. Because I think once we move on to that, we run the risk of just thinking of it as a gender mainstreaming exercise when we have not solved for the structural problems. So I will end here because my time is up. Thank you.
Thank you, Nokwanda. This is quite a personal one as a woman. I remember growing up, I have two brothers and I'm the only one that didn't get a bike, and that affected how I learned to drive a car, still can't cycle. So it starts there. And I think one of the important things that you mentioned is that opportunity to get access to work actually is the background thing. So it's not just the job advertisement that says preference for previously disadvantaged, but it's also going back to equip to make sure that women can actually have those skills so that when the job advertisement is there. I've heard in certain places that, oh, we're re-advertising for the third time because we couldn't get the right candidate. But you're advertising for a role that women have not been skillful. So even if you say preference for women or preference for a Black woman, you're not going to get one with those skills, or there are very few of them that you even know who to call. And if they still like their current job, then you can't get them. So we have about 5 to 7 minutes for questions so that I can release you to your lunch. And not forgetting that we have an online audience. So if we've got questions there, please show them on the screen. But yeah, we can start with a question from in the room. Lebogang.
Okay, first of all, thank you for all the presentations. My question is for Nokwanda with regards to the just transition and just, women. But the question can also be posed to Mamokete with regards to, just incorporating the youth. As we are talking about the just transition and including women and the fact that, women and youth are marginalized, what comes to mind particularly with respect to yesterday's presentation when we were looking at the areas in which opportunities can be, provided for high employment and low emissions. I noticed that most of the jobs were particularly low skilled. So if we are talking about incorporating women within this just transition and the jobs that are opening up, excluding the jobs that are obviously going to open up in the renewable sector. What are we saying about protecting women from precarious work? Because if essentially the jobs that are, majority of the jobs that are going to be available are going to be low skilled, isn't it a no-brainer that women, mostly women are going to be driven to those ones, and then men most likely because of the skills be driven into the renewable one? So in essence, how do we ensure that this just transition protects women from precarious work? And then secondly, how do we prioritize, reskilling, to ensure, efficiency throughout? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentations, beautiful presentations. Mine will be directed to Nontsikelelo as well as Masibulele. Nontsikelelo make mention of the green economic development milestones in the ACZ Atlantis strategic economic zone. You also make emphasis on the skills development in that area, and also made mention of the areas of focus in terms of waste management, as well as teaching people about solar panel installation and so on. Though I think maybe the list might be exhaustive, but those were the few examples that he indicated. I just wanted, my interest is just to understand as to after all these activities have been undertaken, what were the benefits? Did they yield any benefits? Did you perhaps, what are the success stories? Yeah, what benefits were yielded out of the whole training program that was undertaken in that area? My second question will be directed to Masibulele. Masibulele used the word PEP, Public Employment Program, and Extended Public Works Program interchangeably. I'm not sure whether he refers to the very same program, which was established by the National Department of Public Works. And that program was actually designed to run for a particular period. It's not the program that was meant to recycle jobless people. So people were only appointed for a particular period, for a year, short-term or medium terms. In some municipality, it runs for a period of 1.5 or up to 2 years. In your case, if you are referring to the very same program, is it the case in the city of Cape Town that the program is also running for a shorter period, then you have another intake of unemployed youth into the program? And what happens to those which contracts have been terminated? Thank you.
All right. Maybe let's take one more question from the online audience if there's one. No questions. Okay, then we'll take that.
Thanks for the opportunity. My question is directed to Nokwanda. But just before I pose the question, I just want to thank you for the outstanding presentation and really addressing or speaking about the fundamental challenges that are faced by women in the labor market in general. You obviously mentioned that you hadn't included any talking points around industrial policy tools. I'm just curious as to what some of the industrial policy tools could be used in trying to, address this issue. Thank you.
I hope I'm audible. It sounds like it. Thank you for the questions. On the first one, if I remember correctly, Lebogang, you were asking about how do we ensure that women do not remain in low-skilled jobs within the just transition? I mean, firstly, I think we probably have to get women in jobs. And that's not to say that there are no women working. But if most women are working, if most women are working, well, not most women, but if a lot of women are working as domestic workers, it was mentioned even with the EPW program about the transferability of those skills. And I understand the frustrations there because I used to work in the Pretoria CBD. And I remember this one day seeing this guy sweeping the pavement. And I was wondering, how is that a transferable skill? That's an important question to ask. And so if you're looking at women, yes, I am sitting here as a woman in a high position, but that's like, as I was saying yesterday to one of my friends, that's like 4 people and you know each other. How do we then address these issues for the women that we don't know that are working as domestic workers that don't have the protections? And in part, it goes to, reskilling, but also from a young age, making sure that, women have access to these opportunities, that when you are the older sister in the house, you don't become the deputy parent because that takes away from the things that you're able to do. So Khodani was saying about she never got a bike and that's affected how she is able to drive her car. And when you start thinking about those things from that perspective, it can't be just that we want to get the 2 women that are already part of the just transition to then be moved up in terms of green economy jobs. But we need to ensure that there are more women actually doing work and are therefore equipped with the necessary skills to get them moving up even within the green economy job. And also, I think we need to rethink about what we think of as jobs. There was a mention of decent work earlier, and we need to think about what decent work means in terms of a living wage, but then also having the benefits that comes with that, because those benefits go a long way. Like a written contract, for example, that serves as a protection for the worker. If that worker has a written employment contract, they're able to argue for themselves. But also, I think if, for example, you're making contributions to the UIF, you know that you have some level of protections. So we need to think about creating decent jobs, and also sure, most of these care work jobs are important. I'm not saying that they are not important, but can we also turn them into into decent jobs? yes, you have a domestic worker. Can that domestic worker be protected? And in the context of the just transition, for example, once you start getting these up and coming younger workers, how do you then ensure that they're equipped with the necessary skills that they're able to then move up the chain, not just doing, you know, like, oh, I have a job, I go to work and I print and I read newspapers, but making sure that there's actual training provided within employment opportunities. Photocopying is not a skill that's going to get you anywhere, although someone's going to need photocopies. Rapula, in terms of industrial policy tools, I mean, if there's also another, well, it's a working paper, but some of the things I was talking about in that one was what are the ways in which we can support the just transition and also create employment opportunities. And there are many of these things that we can do, including, for example, we know we need to climate proof our infrastructure. We need to climate proof housing. How do we get the people that are currently excluded from the economy into the economy by making sure that they have the skills to then, you know, help build the climate-proofed housing within cement, for example, within the actual construction. Those type of things present the necessary opportunities to start getting women into employment opportunities. But I think right now we're still thinking of it at a very high level. We haven't thought about the actual impacts that on a day-to-day people are experiencing. And we saw that even with the documentary that was presented yesterday in terms of what are the skills that the people in Witbank actually have to help their community. I think once we start talking in that way, once we start thinking about it in that way, then there is a possibility then that the community members come along with us. And in this case, in terms of gender, we can use some of these needs that we have right now. So climate proofing housing, again, we can use those opportunities that are present to then get women into those areas.
Thank you. Nontsikelelo. I keep looking at the screen as if she's right there on the screen. Okay, while we're still trying to get Nontsikelelo, maybe let's get Masibulele to answer his question.
Thank you for that question, and I'll deliberately try to locate it to the intentions of the paper. So essentially part of my interest is looking at how we can use what we have better before we ask for help, essentially. So in the city of Cape Town, before asking for help around the just transition, we are saying that you have an institutional arrangement that's available that we can use in the short to medium term from the public employment programs. So what we mean by public employment programs actually is an extension of these arrangements that we've had in the past 10 years. So we started off as EPWP, the Expanded Public Works, which was started by national government in 2004. But before that, it was called something else, Community-Based Expanded Public Works Program, which date back to the 80s and so on. So when these institutional arrangements came into place, by 2017, we were able to be very confident in our ability to achieve targets from national government to such an extent that in the past 10 years, whatever they throw at us, we achieve, including audits. So that allowed us the space to think broadly around what we mean then by public employment programs. So in this case, EPWP is in itself a branch of what we mean by public employment programs. By public employment programs, we include a specific approach to skilling our people. And by that, I mean, we have the ability to create 3-year programs in the city of Cape Town, deliberately to upskill people. And what this means is that we have a framework that says there must be an exit. So if you're going to get someone into a skilling program, let's say some of the projects we've had, assistant artisans. right? You're getting EPWP workers, mainly without grade 12, teach them artisanal skills, link them to an artisan, qualified artisan in the city of Cape Town. You tell the department, ensure that we have the collaboration in this place, which speaks to what public entrepreneurship is, to ensure that at least some percentage of these people end up somewhere outside the program. And so far, we've been successful in these kind of projects to such an extent that we have entrepreneurs that are at the University of the Western Cape under an EPWP project or a public employment program. This is something that we don't have a benchmark on. So we have these opportunities to play around with these ideas because we are so institutionalized, because we are this mainstreamed. We don't have issues around achieving targets. So now we've moved to a space where we look at what we call the quality of the work opportunity. So we don't really talk about decent work. We're talking about the quality of a work opportunity. To us, the quality of a work opportunity within public employment programs means if the person doesn't have grade 12, get them to grade 12. If they don't have computer skills, give them computer skills. If they don't have financial literacy and so on. So for us, being work ready, for instance, according to our framework, means you have grade 12, you have been introduced to entrepreneurship, you have the basic computer skills, you have the basic financial and personal skills, because we found these to be very critical. I think one of the speakers mentioned something like that throughout our programs. So again, the reason why we're able to do this is because of the institutional arrangements that foster public entrepreneurship, which then anchor the program even more. And this is embedded in what we are saying. The City of Cape Town's just transition process can learn a lot from how we got here, and it can actually use this space in the short term. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have Nontsikelelo?
Yes, sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. So I think I just want to start by responding and perhaps maybe just commenting about what Nokwanda said about sort of not being a gender mainstreaming process and rather dealing with the structural issues. And I mean, I think that a gender mainstreaming exercise can definitely sort of lead to being able to raise awareness to sort of change these structural issues. And I say this because, you know, in a previous organization that I worked for, before COVID gave us hybrid, they would have meetings at 7 o'clock, and I couldn't make it because of childcare, and they just couldn't understand. And obviously, because I was a gender mainstreaming employee, I was female and Black, and only after I left did they sort of have the awareness of saying, well, it's actually not inclusive to have a meeting at 7 o'clock. You know, mothers won't make it at that time. And so, yeah, just to say that. And also just to say that the Atlantis SEZ, which also sort of dealing with the unpaid care work issue, is that when they have these skills program, they ask sort of, you know, I run a focus group where I say, you know, what time is going to work best? And do you need childcare? We can bring childcare to the training site while we've been trained, just so that we can get more women to be able to attend these and have paid work not be a structural issue. So I was asked about the benefits of training here. And I mean, some of the people that we skill here are placed in the manufacturing companies like GRI, which is a wind turbine manufacturer here in Atlantis. And there's K-Tech, which uses recycled plastic bottles to manufacture engineering geotextiles, which is quite huge here. And some of the students are employed there. And I mean, it's quite cheesy to say this, that even those that aren't employed, you know, it brings hope for a very desolate, apartheid manufactured community with such high socioeconomic issues. You know, people are, after the skills training, they manage to create urban farms or farms at home and start, you know, selling vegetables. And I think that makes the incremental difference that I am passionate about. Thank you.
So we've come to the end of our session, a very interesting session, if I can add to that. Thank you to all our presenters. I think I've learned a thing or two today, and I hope that our audience also has. And yeah, also thank you to our audience, both in person and our audience online. Have a good afternoon and enjoy your lunch.